He inherited a frozen log cabin buried deep in the Montana wilderness that no one wanted. And when he finally broke through the ice-sealed root cellar door, what he found hidden beneath wasn't just forgotten. It was worth $245 million and had been buried there for a reason. Powerful men would kill to keep secret. Before we explore this incredible true story, make sure to smash that subscribe button, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The wind off Glacier Peak hit like frozen knives, cutting through even the thickest wool. Marcus Reed stood at the edge of the gravel parking lot outside Henderson and Cross law offices in Whitefish, Montana, staring at a manila envelope that had changed everything. His hands, scarred from years of guiding hunters and survivalists through the backcountry, trembled slightly as he held the letter. Not from cold, though the temperature had dropped to 12 below zero that morning. No, this was something deeper, something that reached into the parts of himself he'd buried a long time ago. Marcus was 41 years old, broad-shouldered, with a thick beard that had gone salt and pepper before its time. His face was weathered by altitude and isolation, his eyes the color of storm clouds over the continental divide. He lived alone in a small cabin outside Kalispell, spending most of his time in the wilderness, where words weren't necessary, and the only expectations came from the mountain itself. People who knew him, and there weren't many, would describe him as capable, quiet, and unreachable. They'd be right on all counts. He hadn't spoken to his family in 17 years, not since the night his father told him he'd never amount to anything more than a drifter with a death wish. Not since his mother chose silence over defending him. Not since his younger sister stopped returning his calls. He'd walked away from all of it. From the arguments and the disappointment and the weight of being the Reed family's greatest failure. He'd found peace in the mountains, or at least something close enough to it that he could survive. But the letter in his hand had dragged all of that back to the surface. Thomas Reed, age 73, deceased. Your uncle, sole beneficiary of estate located at coordinates 48.769, 2 north, 114.2138 west. Property includes land and structures. Please contact our office to arrange transfer of deed and inspection. Marcus had read those words 50 times since the letter arrived 3 days ago. Each time, they felt more impossible. Thomas Reed, his father's older brother. The ghost of the family, the man no one talked about. The uncle Marcus had met exactly twice in his entire life. Once at a funeral when Marcus was 7, standing silent and stern in a black suit that looked wrong on him. Once at a family reunion when Marcus was 14, appearing for less than an hour before vanishing back into whatever shadows he lived in. Thomas had been a mystery, a cautionary tale whispered about at holiday dinners. He'd worked for the government, they said, something classified, something that required him to disappear for months at a time. He'd never married, never had children, never seemed to need anyone. And when he retired, he'd gone even deeper into isolation, buying land somewhere in the remote northern mountains, where winter lasted 8 months, and neighbors were measured in dozens of miles. Marcus had never expected to hear his uncle's name again, let alone inherit anything from him. They'd barely known each other, yet here he stood, holding proof that Thomas Reed had left him everything. The law office door opened, and a woman in her 50s stepped out, glasses perched on her nose, a thick folder under her arm. "Mr. Reed?" she called. "We're ready for you now." Marcus followed her inside, past the warm glow of the reception area, and into a conference room that smelled like old paper and expensive furniture polish. A man sat waiting at the head of the table, gray-haired and professional, his suit pressed to perfection. He stood and extended a hand. "Marcus Reed, I'm Jonathan Henderson. Thank you for coming in. I know this must be a difficult time." Marcus shook his hand, but said nothing. Difficult didn't begin to cover it. They sat, and Henderson opened the folder. spreading documents across the polished wood surface. Maps, photographs, legal papers. Your uncle was very specific in his will. He left his entire estate to you, with one condition: that you personally inspect the property before deciding what to do with it. Why me? Marcus asked, his voice rough from disuse. He'd spent the last week alone on a winter elk survey, and hadn't spoken to another human in days. Henderson adjusted his glasses. He didn't say, but he was adamant. The property cannot be sold, transferred, or demolished until you've been there. Yourself. He left you a letter as well. He slid an envelope across the table, yellowed with age. Marcus's name, written on it in careful script. Marcus stared at it, but didn't reach for it. Not yet. The property, Henderson continued, is extremely remote, 37 miles from the nearest maintained road, accessible only by snowmobile or on foot during winter months. Your uncle built it himself back in 1976. A log cabin, approximately 1,400 square feet, with a generator, well water, and very little else. He lived there full-time for the last 40 years. Alone? Marcus asked. As far as we know, yes. He came into town twice a year for supplies, paid his property taxes on time, never caused trouble, never asked for help. When he didn't show up last October, the county sent a welfare check. They found him in his bed. Natural causes, the coroner said. Peaceful. Marcus absorbed this. 40 years, alone in the frozen wilderness. It sounded less like a life, and more like a sentence. There's one more thing, Henderson said, his tone shifting. Your uncle left specific instructions about the property. He said there are things there that need protection. He didn't elaborate, but he emphasized that you shouldn't let anyone else onto the land until you've seen it for yourself. He was quite insistent about that. A chill ran down Marcus's spine that had nothing to do with the weather. Things that need protection. His exact words. Henderson slid a set of keys across the table. Old brass. Heavy. Worn. Smooth. By decades of use. The coordinates are in the file, along with a hand-drawn map. Cell service is non-existent up there. Satellite phone recommended. And Mr. Reed. He paused. Be careful. It's brutal country, especially this time of year. Marcus pocketed the keys and picked up the letter. His uncle's letter. He didn't open it. Not here. Not in front of strangers. He stood, gathered the documents, and walked out into the biting cold. That night, Marcus sat in his own cabin, the wood stove crackling, his dog Copper curled at his feet. The old retriever had been with him for 9 years, the only living thing Marcus truly trusted. He spread the maps across his kitchen table and studied the route. The property sat deep in the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex, in terrain so rugged that most hunters avoided it entirely. It would take 2 days to reach on snowmobile, longer if the weather turned. He finally opened his uncle's letter. The handwriting was shaky but legible. Marcus, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're probably confused as hell about why I left you anything at all. Truth is, I watched you growing up from a distance. I saw what the family did to you, how they tried to fit you into a box you were never meant for. I recognized it because they did the same to me. I'm not going to tell you what to do with the cabin or the land. That's your choice. But I need you to see it first. There are things there I protected my entire life. Things I couldn't trust anyone else with. You're the only one I believe will understand why. The cabin isn't what it seems. Neither was I. When you get there, look beneath the surface. You'll know what I mean. And Marcus, be careful who you tell about this. Some secrets stay buried for a reason. Thomas Marcus read it 3 times, each word raising more questions than answers. What had his uncle been protecting? Why all the secrecy? And why did Marcus, of all people, deserve this inheritance? He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he packed his gear. Cold weather clothing, emergency supplies, weapons, enough food for a week. He loaded his snowmobile onto the trailer at dawn. Copper, watching with alert eyes from the truck bed. They drove north as the sun crept over the mountains, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of gold and rose. The last maintained road ended at a trailhead 53 miles north of Whitefish. Marcus unloaded the snowmobile, checked his GPS coordinates, and started the engine. The machine roared to life, shattering the morning silence. Copper settled into the cargo sled behind him, and they pushed into the wilderness. The first day of travel was grueling. Marcus followed frozen creek beds and old game trails, navigating through dense timber and across open meadows where the wind had sculpted the snow into knife-edged drifts. The temperature never climbed above zero. His face went numb despite the balaclava. His hands ached inside insulated gloves, but he kept moving, driven by something he couldn't name. Curiosity, maybe, or obligation, or perhaps just the need to understand the man who'd given him this strange inheritance. The wilderness around him was pristine, untouched by human presence. Massive Douglas firs towered overhead, their branches heavy with snow. Elk tracks crisscrossed the terrain, and once he spotted a wolf in the distance, watching him with golden eyes before melting into the timber. This was the kind of country that tested a person, that separated those who respected the mountain from those who merely feared it. Marcus had spent half his life learning to read this landscape, to understand its moods and dangers. Yet even with all his experience, he felt the weight of isolation pressing down. Out here, a single mistake could be fatal. He made camp that night in a grove of lodgepole pines, pitching a winter tent and melting snow for water. Copper curled against him for warmth as the temperature dropped to 23 below. The stars overhead were so bright they seemed close enough to touch, and the silence was absolute. Marcus had spent hundreds of nights in the backcountry, but this felt different, heavier, like the mountain itself was holding its breath. As he lay in his sleeping bag, he thought about his uncle. Had Thomas made this same journey dozens of times over 40 years? Had he ever doubted his choice to live so far from everything? Marcus imagined him here, alone, maintaining that cabin through countless brutal winters. What kind of man chose that level of isolation? And what could possibly be important enough to guard in such a remote location? The second day brought a storm. Snow fell in thick curtains, erasing visibility beyond 30 feet. Marcus navigated by compass and GPS, inching forward through drifts that sometimes reached the snowmobile's windshield. Progress slowed to a crawl. By mid-afternoon, he'd covered less than 8 miles, but according to his coordinates, he was close. The wind howled through the trees, creating strange harmonics that sounded almost like voices. Marcus's goggles fogged repeatedly, forcing him to stop and clear them. Copper remained vigilant in the sled, his nose testing the air, sensing something Marcus couldn't yet see. The dog had been restless all morning, whining occasionally, ears swiveling at sounds only he could hear. Then, through a break in the storm, he saw it. A clearing opened before him, roughly 2 acres, surrounded by towering spruce trees that formed a natural windbreak. And in the center, barely visible through the falling snow, stood the cabin. Marcus killed the engine and sat in sudden silence, staring. It wasn't what he'd expected. The logs were massive, each one at least 18 inches in diameter, fitted together with the precision of a master craftsman. The roof was metal, steeply pitched to shed snow, and the windows, though small, were double-paned and intact. A stone chimney rose from the center, solid as the mountain itself. The entire structure looked like it had grown from the earth, rather than been built upon it. But what struck Marcus most was the condition. Despite sitting abandoned for months through a brutal winter, the cabin showed no signs of decay, no sagging roofline, no broken windows, no damage from the storms that had surely battered this exposed clearing. It looked maintained, cared for, almost as if his uncle might step out the front door at any moment. The clearing itself seemed deliberately chosen. It sat in a natural depression, protected from the worst winds, with excellent sightlines in all directions. Anyone approaching would be visible long before they reached the cabin. It was the kind of location a military tactician would choose, defensive and secure. Marcus dismounted and approached on foot, Copper at his heels. The snow around the cabin was pristine except for animal tracks, mostly elk and deer. No human footprints, no sign anyone had been here since his uncle's death. Yet, something felt off. The dog sensed it too, moving cautiously, his hackles slightly raised. Marcus circled the cabin once, noting details. The foundation was concrete, poured deep to prevent frost heave. The chimney showed signs of recent use, soot staining the top few feet. Around back, he found a generator shed, also built with the same meticulous care. Inside, through a small window, he could see a diesel generator that looked nearly new. Fuel barrels were stacked neatly, all clearly labeled. He returned to the front and climbed the 3 steps to the covered porch. The wood didn't creak under his weight, unusual for a structure this old. He tried the door. Locked. He pulled out the keys Henderson had given him, selected the largest one, and slid it into the heavy deadbolt. It turned smoothly, well-oiled, despite the cold. The door swung inward on hinges that didn't creak. The interior was dark. Marcus pulled out his flashlight and stepped inside, immediately noting the temperature. It was cold, but not as frigid as outside. The cabin retained heat well, another sign of exceptional construction. The smell hit him first. Not musty or stale like he'd expected, but clean, almost sterile. His flashlight beam swept across the space, revealing a single large room divided into functional areas. A kitchen along one wall, with a propane stove and hand pump sink. A wood stove in the center, pipe rising to the chimney. A bed in one corner, neatly made with military precision. A workbench along another wall, tools hung in precise order. Shelves lined with books, supplies, canned goods, everything organized with military efficiency. But it was the details that made Marcus pause. The door he'd just walked through wasn't ordinary wood. It was reinforced, steel core beneath the log facade, with a deadbolt system that wouldn't look out of place in a bank vault. The windows, though they appeared simple from outside, were actually multi-layered, possibly bulletproof. The walls themselves felt too thick, too solid, as if they concealed something beyond simple insulation. Marcus set down his pack and began a systematic exploration. The cabin was immaculate. No dust, no cobwebs, no signs of rodent activity despite the isolation. His uncle had sealed it tight. The pantry held enough food for a year, everything canned or dried, organized by category and date. Beans, rice, flour, salt, hundreds of cans of vegetables, fruits, meats. The propane tanks were 3/4 full. Emergency supplies were organized in labeled bins. Medical, repair, survival, communication. Everything suggested long-term self-sufficiency and serious preparation. The medical kit alone was impressive. Not a simple first aid box, but a full trauma kit with surgical supplies, antibiotics, even an IV setup. Marcus had seen field hospitals with less equipment. Who needed this level of medical preparation in a remote cabin? In the corner near the bed, Marcus found a small desk. On it sat a journal, leather-bound, thick with entries. He opened it carefully. The first entry was dated April 2nd, 1976, day 1 at the site. Construction begins tomorrow. Foundation poured last fall before the frost. Everything must be perfect. Everything must last. What I'm building here isn't just a home. It's a vault. Marcus flipped through the pages. Detailed construction notes, supply lists, observations about the land and weather. But also, stranger entries. References to the collection and secure storage and contingency protocols. His uncle wrote like someone preparing for a specific threat. though he never named what that threat might be. One entry from June of 1977 caught his attention. Third, delivery complete. Storage capacity at 60%. Security systems tested and functional. If anyone finds this place, they'll need to earn access. Can't risk the wrong people getting through. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. What deliveries? What security systems? He continued reading, finding entries that spanned decades. His uncle had been meticulous, recording weather patterns, wildlife observations, maintenance schedules, but scattered throughout were cryptic references that painted a picture of something far more complex than a simple wilderness retreat. Mentions of asset protection and authentication protocols and fail-safe measures. The most recent entry was dated September 15th, just weeks before his uncle's death. 41 years here, kept my promise, protected what needed protecting. Time is short now, can feel it in my bones. Marcus will understand when he's ready. Left him everything because he's the only one who won't be corrupted by it. The only one who chose the mountain over the money. He'll know what to do. Marcus closed the journal slowly, his hands trembling. His uncle had been watching him, evaluating him, preparing to pass something on. But what? Copper whined from near the wood stove, pawing at something. Marcus walked over and knelt beside the dog. Copper was focused on the floor, on a particular section of the wide plank boards. At first, Marcus saw nothing unusual. But when he ran his hand across the wood, he felt it. A slight variation in texture, a seam so subtle it was nearly invisible. His pulse quickened. He grabbed a knife from his belt and carefully worked the blade into the seam. The board lifted slightly, revealing that it wasn't nailed down like the others. It was a hatch, cleverly disguised, fitted so precisely that even the wood grain matched the surrounding planks. He pried it up fully and shone his flashlight into the space below. A ladder descended into darkness. Cold air rose from the opening, carrying a scent Marcus couldn't quite identify. Something mineral, like underground stone. His flashlight beam couldn't reach the bottom. He thought about his uncle's letter. Look beneath the surface. Marcus grabbed his larger flashlight and his weapon, a .45 caliber pistol he carried for bear protection. Stay, he told Copper, then descended into the opening. The ladder was steel, bolted securely to the wall. It dropped 15 feet into a tunnel, not natural but excavated, the walls lined with timber supports. Marcus's breath fogged in the frigid air. The tunnel extended forward, angling slightly downward, reinforced every 6 feet with heavy beams. The engineering was professional, the kind of work that required knowledge, equipment, and time. Someone had spent considerable effort building this, and they'd built it to last. He followed it for 30 feet until it opened into a larger space. His flashlight beam swept across the area, and his breath caught in his throat. It was a room. No, a chamber. Roughly 20 feet by 30 feet, carved from the earth beneath the cabin, the walls concrete, the ceiling supported by steel I-beams, and it was full. Shelves lined every wall, packed with boxes, crates, filing cabinets. A workbench held equipment Marcus didn't recognize, computers from another era, radio equipment, devices with dials and switches, whose purposes he could only guess. But in the center of the room, illuminated by his flashlight, sat something that made his blood run cold. A door, heavy iron, like something from a bank vault, with a complex locking mechanism and a wheel handle. It was set into the far wall, clearly leading to another chamber beyond this one. The door itself was extraordinary, at least 8 inches thick, with reinforced edges and what appeared to be a hermetic seal around the frame. Marcus approached it slowly, his boots echoing on the concrete floor. The door was massive, with hinges that looked like they could support a truck. Beside it, mounted on the wall, was a keypad, modern, electronic, still glowing faintly with power. A small LED light blinked green, indicating the system was active. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to secure whatever lay beyond that door. Someone had built a fortress beneath this remote cabin, hidden it perfectly, and protected it with systems that wouldn't be out of place in a government facility. The level of sophistication was staggering. This wasn't the work of a paranoid hermit. This was professional, military-grade security. Marcus reached out and touched the cold iron surface. His hand trembled slightly. He thought about his uncle living here for 40 years, alone, guarding this place. He thought about the letter, about secrets that needed to stay buried. He thought about the warning to be careful who he told. What the hell had Thomas Reed been protecting? And why had he left it all to Marcus? The flashlight beam caught something etched into the metal beside the door. Letters, small and precise, clearly done with an engraving tool. For Marcus, when you're ready, trust no one until you understand. Marcus stood in the freezing darkness, staring at his name carved into iron, and realized that inheriting this cabin had just become infinitely more complicated than he'd ever imagined. His uncle hadn't left him a home. He'd left him a mystery, a responsibility, and possibly a danger he couldn't yet comprehend. The implications crashed over him like an avalanche. This vault, this security, the decades of isolation, it all pointed to something significant, something valuable, or dangerous, or both. And his uncle had protected it alone, without help, without backup, for 4 decades. Above him, through the tunnel and the hidden hatch, Copper barked once, sharp, urgent, then twice. A warning bark. Marcus knew well. Someone else was here. Marcus killed his flashlight immediately, plunging himself into absolute darkness. His heart hammered against his ribs. He moved toward the ladder by memory, one hand trailing the wall, the other gripping his pistol. The complete darkness was disorienting, but he didn't dare use light now. Copper barked again, more insistent. Then Marcus heard it, the distinct rumble of a snowmobile engine, maybe more than one, approaching the clearing. His mind raced. No one should be out here. The property was 37 miles from anywhere, in the middle of a winter storm, accessible only to those who knew exactly where they were going. Someone had been watching. Someone had waited for him to arrive. And now they were here. Marcus moved through the darkness with practiced silence, his fingers finding the steel ladder. Above him, Copper's barking had stopped, replaced by a low, continuous growl. The engine sounds grew louder, then cut off. Voices drifted down through the hidden hatch, muffled but distinct. At least 2 men, maybe 3. He climbed the ladder quickly, emerging into the cabin just as shadows passed across the windows. Marcus closed the hatch silently, the board settling back into place with a soft click. Copper stood rigid near the door, teeth bared, hackles raised along his spine. Marcus grabbed the dog's collar and pulled him toward the back of the cabin, positioning himself where he could see the front door while remaining in shadow. Through the window, he watched 3 figures approach. They wore heavy winter gear, faces obscured by balaclavas and goggles. They moved with purpose, not like lost travelers, but like men who knew exactly where they were and what they were looking for. One gestured toward the cabin, while another pulled out what looked like a radio or GPS device. The lead man tried the door handle. Finding it locked, he stepped back and examined the reinforced frame. He said something to his companions, and one of them produced a large pry bar. Marcus's jaw tightened. They were breaking in, and they had the tools to do it. He had seconds to decide. Confront them? Hide? The nearest exit was the back window, but leaving meant abandoning whatever his uncle had protected. It meant letting strangers access the vault below. Yet fighting 3 armed men in an isolated cabin was suicide. The decision was made for him when Copper lunged, barking furiously. The sound echoed through the cabin like gunshots. The men outside froze. Then the lead figure pulled a weapon from his coat. Marcus saw the glint of steel. "Federal agents!" Marcus shouted. his voice commanding, hoping the bluff would work. "You're trespassing on private property. Identify yourselves." The men didn't respond. Instead, they scattered, taking defensive positions behind the generator shed and nearby trees. Professional movements. These weren't casual trespassers or curious locals. They were trained. A tense silence followed, broken only by the wind howling through the pines. Then a voice called out, accentless and cold, "Mr. Reed, we're not here to hurt you. We just want to talk about your uncle's property." Marcus said nothing, his mind racing. How did they know his name? How did they know he'd be here? "We know what Thomas was protecting," the voice continued. "We know what's under that cabin. You're in over your head, son. Walk away now, while you can." Marcus kept his pistol trained on the door, his other hand on Copper's collar, to keep the dog quiet. "I don't know what you're talking about. This is just a cabin." A pause. Then, "Don't insult our intelligence. We've been watching this place for years. We know about the vault. We know what's inside. Your uncle was very good at keeping secrets, but nothing stays hidden forever." The words sent ice through Marcus's veins. They'd been watching for years, which meant his uncle had known he was being monitored, had lived under surveillance, and had still managed to keep whatever was below secure. "If you've been watching for years," Marcus called back, "then you know my uncle never let anyone in. That should tell you something. It tells us he was stubborn and paranoid. But he's dead now, and you just inherited a problem you can't solve. We're offering you a solution. Walk away. Leave the property. We'll compensate you fairly." Marcus laughed, though there was no humor in it. "You're threatening me on my own land and calling it an offer." Another pause. When the voice returned, it had hardened. "You have 12 hours to reconsider. We'll be back, and next time, we won't ask nicely." The figures retreated to their snowmobiles. Engines roared to life, and within moments, they disappeared into the storm, leaving only tracks in the snow. Marcus waited a full 5 minutes before moving, making sure they were truly gone. His hands shook slightly, not from fear but from adrenaline. Copper pressed against his leg, still alert, still ready to defend. "Good boy," Marcus whispered, scratching behind the dog's ears. "Good boy." He moved to the window and studied the tracks. 3 machines, professional grade, expensive, the kind government agencies used, or private military contractors. The boot prints were large, deliberate, showing no signs of hesitation or uncertainty. These men knew wilderness travel and knew violence. Marcus returned to the hidden hatch and descended once more into the tunnel. This time, he moved with urgency. Whatever was behind that iron door, it was worth threatening a man over, worth surveillance and potential violence. He needed to know what his uncle had died protecting. Back in the underground chamber, Marcus examined the vault door more carefully. The keypad glowed softly, waiting for input. He had no code, no combination. But beside the keypad, he noticed something he'd missed before. A small slot, the size and shape of a key. He pulled out the ring of keys Henderson had given him. Most were standard, but one was different, smaller, more intricate, with unusual grooves along its length. He inserted it into the slot. It fit perfectly. The keypad beeped once, and text appeared on a small digital screen. "Biometric verification required. Place hand on scanner." A panel slid open beside the keypad, revealing a glass surface that glowed blue. A handprint scanner. Marcus stared at it, frustration building. He didn't have his uncle's handprint. This door was going to stay locked, and those men would return in 12 hours to take whatever was inside by force. Then he remembered something. His uncle's letter had said, "You'll know what I mean," and the engraving on the door, "When you're ready." Marcus placed his own hand on the scanner. The glass pulsed blue, reading his palm and fingerprints. The system beeped 3 times. Then, impossibly, the screen displayed, "Marcus Reed, authorization confirmed. Welcome." The massive wheel handle clicked once, releasing internal locks. The door's hermetic seal hissed as pressure equalized. Marcus gripped the wheel and turned. It moved smoothly, the door swinging outward on perfectly balanced hinges despite its tremendous weight. Cold air rushed out, even colder than the chamber he stood in. Marcus shone his flashlight into the darkness beyond. What he saw made him forget how to breathe. The vault was enormous, easily 40 feet long and 30 feet wide, carved deep into the mountain bedrock. The walls were lined with climate-controlled display cases, industrial shelving units, and secure storage containers. But it was the contents that stopped Marcus cold. He stepped inside slowly, his flashlight beam revealing wonders with each sweep. Glass cases held rare coins, arranged by era and country. Gold coins that gleamed like small suns. Roman auri, Byzantine solidi, Spanish doubloons. Each case was labeled with meticulous detail: mint, date, origin, estimated value. Marcus approached the first case, his breath fogging the glass. Inside were 50 gold double eagles, American $20 coins from the early 1900s. The label read, 1907, high relief, 50 pieces, mint state, est, value, 2.4 million. He moved to the next case. More coins, these even older. Greek drachmas, Persian darics, coins that belonged in museums. Thousands of them, organized and preserved with professional care. But the coins were just the beginning. Along the far wall stood a series of metal shelving units, each holding wooden crates. Marcus opened the first one carefully. Inside, wrapped in acid-free paper, were documents. Not ordinary papers, but historical artifacts. He lifted one gently. A land deed from 1776, signed by Benjamin Franklin. Another, a letter from Abraham Lincoln, dated 1863, discussing the Emancipation Proclamation. Another, original architectural drawings for the Brooklyn Bridge. Marcus's hands trembled as he rifled through the crate. Every document was authenticated, catalogued, preserved. Each one was worth a fortune, not just in money, but in historical significance. These weren't supposed to be in a mountain vault. They belonged in the National Archives, in university collections, in museums. He moved to the next crate. More documents, these from the 20th century. Treaties, agreements, letters between world leaders. Original drafts of speeches that had changed history. Winston Churchill's handwritten notes from Yalta. A telegram from the Cuban Missile Crisis. Documents that weren't just valuable, they were dangerous. The kind of papers that could rewrite historical narratives or expose uncomfortable truths. Marcus's mind reeled. How had his uncle acquired these? Why were they hidden? And more importantly, who else knew they existed? He continued his exploration, each discovery more staggering than the last. In the center of the vault stood a series of reinforced containers. Marcus opened the first and nearly dropped his flashlight. Gold bars, stacked neatly, 50 to a container, each bar stamped with official markings, 400 troy ounces, 9999 fine gold. He counted quickly. 10 containers, 50 bars each. That was 500 bars, 200,000 troy ounces. At current prices, roughly $400 million in gold. But there was more. Beside the gold containers sat wooden boxes, filled with bearer bonds. Anonymous financial instruments that functioned like cash. Marcus picked one up, reading the denomination, $10 million, payable to bearer. There were dozens of them, maybe hundreds, stuffed into boxes like they were newspaper clippings. His legs felt weak. He sat down hard on one of the empty crates, trying to process what he was seeing. This wasn't a collection. This was a treasure vault, a repository of wealth and history that defied comprehension. The total value had to be in the hundreds of millions, possibly more, and his uncle had guarded it alone for 40 years. Marcus's flashlight beam found something else. A desk in the corner, similar to the one upstairs, but larger. On it sat more journals, file folders, and a locked metal box. He approached it like a man in a dream, his sense of reality badly fractured. He opened the first journal, dated 1974. The handwriting was his uncle's, but younger, steadier. The first page read, "I never wanted this, never asked for it, but someone had to do it, and I was the one they chose. Or maybe I was the only one foolish enough to say yes. The agency calls it Operation Preservation. The unofficial name is more accurate. Operation Cover Your Ass." When the intelligence networks realized how much wealth they'd accumulated through black operations, when they understood that official records would expose decades of illegal activities, they needed a solution. They needed someone to take it all off the books. Someone who could vanish. Someone expendable. That was me. Marcus read on, his chest tightening with each paragraph. His uncle had been a CIA operative, recruited in 1968, trained in asset recovery and covert logistics. For 6 years, he'd worked in the shadows, moving money and valuables that couldn't appear on any government ledger. Gold from regime changes, bonds from arms deals, historical documents seized during operations that were never supposed to exist. By 1974, the operation had grown too large, too dangerous. The Cold War had generated mountains of off-book assets, and too many people knew about them. So the agency had created a solution. Find one man willing to take everything and disappear. They'd given Thomas Reed a choice: die in a staged accident, or spend the rest of his life as a ghost, protecting secrets that could destroy governments if they ever came to light. Thomas had chosen the cabin. He'd built this vault, established security protocols, and spent 4 decades making sure the truth stayed buried. The agency had paid him well, depositing funds regularly into offshore accounts. But the real payment was survival. As long as he kept the secrets, they left him alone. Marcus set down the journal and picked up another, this one from 1998. 22 years now. Sometimes I wonder if anyone even remembers I'm here. My original handlers are dead or retired. The operations that generated this wealth are ancient history. But the secrets remain dangerous. Some of these documents could still cause international incidents. Some of this gold is stolen, technically. Some of these bonds were issued by governments that no longer exist. If any of it surfaces, questions will be asked. Investigations will be launched. People will die to protect their legacies. So, I stay. I guard. I wait. Marcus felt tears sting his eyes. His uncle hadn't been a hermit by choice. He'd been a prisoner, sentenced to a lifetime of isolation to protect institutions that had probably forgotten him. The mountain hadn't been his refuge. It had been his cage. He opened the final journal, dated just months before his uncle's death. "I'm dying," doctor in Whitefish confirmed. It last visit. 6 months, maybe less. Cancer, spread too far to treat. Ironic that I survived 40 years in this isolation, only to be taken by something so mundane. I've made arrangements. Everything goes to Marcus. He doesn't know me, but I've watched him. He chose the mountains over money, solitude over status. He's the only one I trust to understand what I protected and why. The agency won't like it. They'll send someone to retrieve the assets or eliminate the problem. But Marcus is smart, tough. If anyone can navigate this mess, it's him. I've programmed the vault to recognize his biometrics. Everything he needs is in the locked box on the desk. Papers, account numbers, contacts. Tell him, I'm sorry. Sorry for the burden. Sorry for the danger. But also tell him this. What's in this vault could do enormous good if handled correctly. It's not just wealth. It's truth. And truth matters, even when it's dangerous. Especially when it's dangerous. Marcus opened the locked box with another key from his ring. Inside were passports, Multiple identities his uncle had maintained, bank statements showing accounts worth tens of millions, encrypted drives, contact information for lawyers and financial experts around the world, and one final letter addressed to Marcus. He opened it with shaking hands. "Marcus, if you're reading this, you've opened the vault. You've seen what I protected. Now you face a choice. Walk away and let the agency reclaim everything, or take possession and accept the responsibility that comes with it. I can't tell you what to do, but I can tell you this. The wealth in this vault could change thousands of lives. The documents could expose truths that matter, or everything could be buried again, hidden for another 40 years, protecting institutions that don't deserve protection. You're free in ways I never was. You have no loyalty to the agency, no obligation to keep their secrets. Whatever you decide, know that I chose you because I believe you'll do what's right, not what's easy. The account information in this box gives you access to funds I set aside, enough to disappear if you need to, or enough to fight if you choose that path. Either way, you're not alone. There are people who can help, people I've trusted over the years. Their contacts are in the drive. Be careful, be smart. And Marcus, live the life I couldn't. Don't let this place become your prison." Thomas. Marcus sat in the cold silence of the vault, surrounded by more wealth than he could comprehend, and felt the weight of his inheritance settle onto his shoulders like chains. His uncle had given him a gift and a curse, freedom and responsibility, truth and danger, all wrapped together. What happens next will turn Marcus's quiet life upside down, reveal truths powerful men have killed to protect, and test whether one man can stand against forces that operate in shadows. Stay tuned to see what Marcus does with the most dangerous inheritance in American history. If you're enjoying this story, please like, share, and subscribe for more incredible true stories. The flashlight flickered, reminding Marcus he'd been underground for over an hour. His mind was still reeling from the discovery, trying to process the magnitude of what his uncle had protected. He needed time to think, to plan, but time was something he didn't have. The men outside had given him 12 hours. That meant he had maybe 10 left before they returned with more force, more weapons, more determination. He gathered the journals and the locked box, taking them back up to the cabin. The storm outside intensified, snow falling so thick he could barely see beyond the porch. Good. That would slow anyone trying to return. Bad. That meant he was trapped here too, unable to leave without risking death in whiteout conditions. Marcus built a fire in the wood stove and spread the materials across his uncle's desk. Copper lay nearby, still alert, watching the door. Marcus began to read through everything systematically, looking for answers, looking for options. The encrypted drives contained detailed records of every item in the vault. His uncle had been meticulous. Each coin catalogued, each document authenticated, each gold bar numbered and tracked. The total value, according to the most recent assessment, $245 million. But more valuable than the money were the documents. Marcus scrolled through the inventory, his stomach tightening with each entry. There were papers that could implicate sitting senators in illegal arms deals from the 80s. Documents showing how certain American corporations had financed both sides of foreign conflicts. Evidence of assassinations, coups, operations that had killed thousands while enriching a select few. His uncle had been sitting on enough information to bring down a significant portion of the American intelligence and defense establishment. No wonder the agency wanted it back. No wonder they'd isolated Thomas in the wilderness for 40 years. Marcus found the contact list his uncle had mentioned. Names, numbers, encrypted email addresses. People described as trusted or reliable under pressure, or will help if approached correctly. There was a lawyer in Seattle specializing in whistleblower cases, a journalist who'd broken major national security stories, a former senator who'd built a reputation fighting intelligence overreach. Even a few retired agency operatives who'd apparently grown disgusted with what they'd seen. But could Marcus trust any of them? His uncle's letter said these people were reliable, but 40 years had passed. Loyalties changed. People were compromised. The men who'd shown up today proved that someone was watching, waiting. They might be monitoring these contacts too. Marcus stood and walked to the window, peering out into the storm. The tracks from the snowmobiles were already being erased by fresh snow. By morning, there'd be no evidence anyone had been here at all. He thought about the vault below, about all that wealth and truth buried in the mountain. His uncle had died protecting it, had sacrificed a normal life to keep it secret. But to what end? So it could stay hidden forever. So corrupt institutions could continue operating without accountability. Or had Thomas been waiting, hoping that someday someone would be brave enough to drag it all into the light? Marcus's grandfather had once told him that the hardest thing about living in the wilderness wasn't the cold or the danger. It was deciding what kind of person you wanted to be when nobody was watching. Out here, there were no rules, except the ones you made for yourself. You could be noble or cruel, honest or deceptive, and the mountain didn't care. It just reflected back whatever you brought to it. Marcus had spent 17 years in these mountains, trying to escape expectations and judgments. He'd thought isolation would bring peace. But his uncle had learned a harder truth. Isolation didn't free you from choices. It just made those choices yours alone. A sound outside snapped Marcus back to attention. Copper growled low. Marcus grabbed his pistol and moved to the window. Nothing. Just whine through the trees, snow swirling in eddies across the clearing. But Copper's instincts were rarely wrong. Something had changed in the environment, something subtle enough that Marcus's human senses couldn't detect it. He scanned the tree line carefully, looking for any sign of movement. There, just visible through the snow, a faint red glow. Small, steady, not a fire, more like a light, electronic, positioned at the edge of the clearing. Marcus's blood ran cold. A camera, or a motion sensor. Someone had placed surveillance equipment while he was underground. They weren't just watching from a distance. They'd ringed his position, probably placed equipment on multiple sides. The men hadn't left. They'd just repositioned. They were out there right now, in the storm, monitoring his movements. He quickly checked the other windows. From the back window, he spotted another faint glow. This one green. From the side, a third device, barely visible in the blowing snow. They'd established a perimeter, a surveillance net. Every exit was being watched. Marcus felt the trap closing around him. They knew he couldn't leave in this storm. They knew he was alone except for the dog. They were waiting, patient, letting the situation play out. When the 12 hours expired, they'd move in with overwhelming force. He needed help, but his satellite phone might already be compromised. If they had surveillance equipment, they probably had signal intercept capabilities. Any call he made could be monitored, traced, used against him. Marcus returned to the desk and pulled up the encrypted drive. His uncle had mentioned contacts, people who could help, but there was another folder he'd noticed earlier, labeled simply Emergency Protocol. He opened it. Inside was a single document, a contingency plan his uncle had developed years ago. If the vault was ever compromised, if Thomas was ever forced to abandon the site, there was a network in place. Not just contacts, but a system. Safe houses scattered across 3 states. Lawyers with sealed instructions to be opened upon specific triggers. Financial accounts that would automatically release funds if certain conditions were met. Even retired operatives who'd agreed to provide security if called upon. At the bottom of the document was a phone number with a note. Use only in absolute emergency. Voice. Authentication required. Say, Thomas sent me. This will activate the network. Marcus stared at the number, his mind racing. This was it, the decision point. He could call this number, activate whatever network his uncle had built, and commit himself to a path he didn't fully understand. Or he could try to negotiate with the men outside, hand over the vault, walk away. The first option meant danger, meant fighting forces with resources and reach he couldn't match. The second meant betraying his uncle's 40-year sacrifice and letting truth stay buried. He thought about Thomas Reed, living alone in this cabin for 4 decades, protecting secrets that weren't even his. A man who'd been given an impossible choice and had made it, every single day, for 40 years. Marcus had always thought his uncle was crazy, or damaged, or just broken. But now he understood. Thomas hadn't been running from the world. He'd been standing guard over it. Marcus picked up the satellite phone. His decision made. He'd spent 17 years running from responsibility, from family, from expectations. But some burdens chose you. Some fights found you, even when you tried to hide. He dialed the number. It rang 3 times before someone answered. No greeting, just breathing. "Thomas sent me," Marcus said, his voice steady despite his pounding heart. A pause. Then a voice, older, cautious. Verification required. What was Thomas's favorite drink? Marcus thought back to the family reunion, the one time he'd actually talked to his uncle. They'd sat on a porch while Marcus's father ranted inside. Thomas had offered him something from a flask. "Scotch," Marcus said. "Single malt. Macallan, if he could get it." Another pause. "Accepted. You're the nephew, Marcus. Thomas briefed us that you might call. What's your situation?" Armed men showed up at the property. "They know about the vault. They've given me 12 hours to leave. They've established surveillance around the cabin. I'm trapped." "How? Many?" "3 that I saw. Possibly more." "Armed?" "Yes." "Professional?" "Very." The voice was quiet for a moment, thinking. "Okay. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to sit tight. Don't engage. Don't leave the cabin. We'll have people there in 8 hours. Can you hold out that long? In this storm?" "Yes." "Good." Thomas left very specific instructions about how to handle this scenario. "We're activating the protocol now. You're not alone, Marcus. Your uncle spent 40 years building safeguards. Trust the system. We'll get you out." The line went dead. Marcus set down the phone, his hands shaking slightly. He'd done it. Committed himself. There was no going back now. He looked at Copper, who watched him with brown eyes that seemed to understand everything. "Guess we're in this now, boy." Outside, the storm raged on, and somewhere in the darkness, men with weapons waited for their moment. But inside the cabin, surrounded by his uncle's journals and secrets worth hundreds of millions, Marcus Reed felt something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. The 8 hours stretched like days. Marcus kept the fire burning low, just enough for warmth without creating smoke that might signal activity. He moved through the cabin systematically, checking sight lines, reinforcing weak points, preparing for whatever came next. The surveillance lights outside blinked steadily through the storm, patient as predators. Copper stayed alert, his ears swiveling at every sound. Marcus envied the dog's clarity. No moral dilemmas for him. No wrestling with right and wrong. Just loyalty and instinct. Marcus returned to his uncle's journals, reading deeper into the years of isolation. One entry from 1983 caught his attention. 15 years ago today, I buried my old life. Sometimes I wonder what I gave up. A wife, maybe. Children. The kind of ordinary happiness other men take for granted. But then, I think about what's in that vault. The evidence of crimes that killed thousands. The wealth stolen from entire nations. If I'd walked away, if I'd let them bury it all in some government warehouse where it would disappear, what would that make me? Complicit. I chose this prison because the alternative was being their accomplice. Marcus set down the journal and stared at the fire. His uncle had made peace with his choices. But had those choices been right? Or had Thomas just convinced himself they were to survive the loneliness? His mind drifted back to the family reunion. That summer, when Marcus was 14. It had been held at his grandmother's farmhouse in western Montana, one of those obligatory gatherings where relatives who barely tolerated each other pretended everything was fine. Marcus had spent most of the day hiding in the barn, avoiding his father's criticism and his cousin's mockery. That's where Thomas had found him. Marcus remembered his uncle appearing in the barn doorway like a ghost, silent and watchful. He'd been maybe 50 then, though he looked older. Hard living had carved lines into his face that age alone couldn't explain. "You hiding or thinking?" Thomas had asked, his voice rough from disuse. "Both," Marcus had replied. Defensive. Thomas had nodded and sat down on a hay bale, not saying anything more. They'd sat in comfortable silence for maybe 10 minutes before Marcus's curiosity won out. "Why don't you ever come to these things?" he'd asked. "Same reason you're hiding in a barn," Thomas had replied. "Sometimes family isn't what we need it to be. Dad says you wasted your life." Thomas had smiled, though it hadn't reached his eyes. "Your father measures worth in dollars and status. By his standards, I did waste it. By mine, I didn't. What's your standard?" Thomas had looked at him then. Really looked. Like he was evaluating something important, doing what's right, even when it costs you everything. Marcus hadn't understood. At the time, he'd been a kid, still believing the world was simpler than it was. But now, sitting in his uncle's cabin, surrounded by secrets worth millions, he understood perfectly. Thomas had paid everything to do what he believed was right. His family, his freedom, his entire life. And now he'd passed that burden to Marcus. A sound outside jerked Marcus from his memories. Not wind, not animals, engines, multiple machines approaching through the storm. He checked his watch. 6 hours since the call. Too early for the promised help. Marcus killed the lights and moved to the window. Through the blowing snow, he counted headlights. 5 snowmobiles, maybe 6, converging on the clearing from different directions. They stopped at the tree line, forming a loose perimeter. Figures dismounted, more than a dozen, far more than the 3 who'd come before. They weren't waiting 12 hours. They were moving now. Marcus grabbed his rifle from where it leaned against the wall, checked the chamber, and positioned himself where he could see multiple approaches. Copper pressed against his leg, sensing the threat. A voice boomed through a megaphone, cutting through the storm. "Marcus Reed, we know you're in there. We're not leaving without what we came for. You can make this easy, or you can make it hard. Either way, we're taking possession of that vault." Marcus said nothing, watching the figures spread out around the cabin. They moved with military precision, establishing fields of fire, covering angles. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a siege. "You've got 30 seconds to respond," the voice continued. "After that, we come in, and we won't be gentle." Marcus's mind raced. He was outnumbered at least 12 to 1, possibly more. The cabin was defensible but not impregnable. If they decided to force entry, he couldn't stop them all. But giving up meant betraying everything his uncle had died protecting. 20 seconds. He thought about the satellite phone, about the promise that help was coming. But 2 hours was an eternity in a firefight. He'd be dead or captured long before anyone arrived. 15 seconds. Marcus made a decision. He wasn't going to surrender, but he wasn't going to fight a battle he couldn't win either. There was another option. One his uncle had probably planned for. He ran to the hidden hatch and descended into the tunnel. In the vault, he grabbed one of the encrypted drives, stuffed it into his jacket, and then moved to a section of the chamber he hadn't fully explored. According to his uncle's journals, there should be an emergency exit, a tunnel leading away from the vault to a concealed opening a quarter mile into the forest. 10 seconds. He found it behind a false wall panel, exactly where the journal described. A narrow passage. barely wide enough for a man, angling upward into darkness. Marcus whistled for Copper. The dog bounded down the ladder and into the vault. Marcus grabbed emergency supplies from a pre-packed bag his uncle had left, slung it over his shoulder, and entered the escape tunnel. 5 seconds. Above him, he heard the cabin door explode inward. Boots thundered across the floor. Voices shouted commands. They were inside. Marcus moved through the tunnel as quickly as the confined space allowed, pushing the bag ahead of him, Copper scrambling behind. The passage was rough-hewn, supported by timber beams, clearly hand-dug over many years. His uncle had prepared for this exact scenario, had known that someday the vault would be compromised. Behind him, Marcus heard the sounds of discovery. Someone had found the hidden hatch. Flashlight beams swept through the main chamber. Shouts of amazement echoed as they saw the vault's contents. But they hadn't found the escape tunnel yet. Not yet. Marcus crawled faster, ignoring the pain in his knees and elbows. The tunnel seemed endless, a claustrophobic nightmare of earth and darkness. His breath came in ragged gasps. Copper whined but kept moving. Then, finally, he saw it. A faint circle of gray light ahead. The exit. He emerged into the storm, pushing through a concealed opening camouflaged with branches and snow. The world outside was chaos. Wind screaming through the pines. Snow falling so thick he couldn't see 10 feet. Perfect cover. Marcus oriented himself quickly, checking his compass. The escape route had taken him northeast, away from the main approach routes. He needed to put distance between himself and the cabin before they discovered he'd escaped. He ran, pushing through waist-deep drifts, following a ridgeline that offered the best combination of speed and concealment. Copper struggled through the snow but kept pace, driven by the same instinct that had kept wolves alive for millennia. When predators come, you run or you die. Behind them, shouts echoed through the forest. They'd found the tunnel. They'd discovered his escape. And now, they were coming. Marcus pushed harder, his lungs burning, his legs screaming. The storm was both enemy and ally, hiding him but also making every step a battle. He couldn't maintain this pace. The cold would kill him as surely as a bullet if he didn't find shelter soon. He thought about his uncle's emergency protocols, about the safe houses mentioned in the files. The nearest one was supposed to be 15 miles northeast, an old fire lookout tower that had been converted into a hidden cache. 15 miles in this storm, with armed men pursuing him, seemed impossible. But impossible had become his new reality. Marcus ran on, following the terrain, using his wilderness skills to navigate without landmarks. He'd spent 17 years learning this country, understanding how the land flowed, where the ridges led, where shelter could be found. Those years were the only thing keeping him alive now. An hour passed, maybe 2. Time lost, meaning in the whiteout. His pursuers had fallen behind, their voices fading into the storm. Either they'd lost his trail, or they'd decided the conditions were too dangerous to continue. Either way, Marcus had bought himself breathing room. He found shelter in an overhang of rock, a shallow cave that offered protection from the wind. He collapsed inside, gasping, every muscle trembling from exertion and cold. Copper curled against him, both of them shaking. Marcus pulled out the encrypted drive he'd taken from the vault. This small piece of technology contained records of everything, every document, every coin, every gold bar. It was insurance, proof that the vault existed and what it contained. If anything happened to him, if the men captured the physical assets, this drive could still expose the truth. He tucked it into an inner pocket, next to his chest, where his body heat would protect it from the cold. As his breathing steadied, Marcus's thoughts turned back to his uncle. Had Thomas ever run through these same mountains, pursued by the same kind of men? How many times over 40 years had he faced threats like this? And how had he found the strength to keep going, year after year, alone? Another memory surfaced. This one from the funeral when Marcus was 7. He remembered standing at the graveside, his grandfather being buried, and seeing Thomas standing apart from the family. Everyone else had clustered together, sharing grief and comfort. But Thomas had stood alone, straight-backed, silent, like a soldier at attention. Later, Marcus's father had muttered something about Thomas being cold, unfeeling, unable to connect like normal people. But now Marcus understood. His uncle hadn't been cold. He'd been careful. Even then, he'd been living a double life, protecting secrets, maintaining distance. Every interaction was calculated, every relationship a potential liability. What kind of strength did that require? To live among family without ever truly being part of them, to attend funerals and reunions, knowing you could never explain where you'd been or what you did. Marcus had thought his own isolation was hard, his 17 years of self-imposed exile. But he'd chosen that. He could end it any time he wanted. His uncle hadn't had that luxury. Thomas's isolation had been permanent, absolute, ending only with death. The storm began to ease slightly, the wind dropping to a steady howl instead of a shriek. Marcus knew he couldn't stay here long. The men would regroup, expand their search, bring more resources. He needed to reach that fire lookout, contact the network his uncle had built, and figure out his next move. He pulled out his satellite phone and checked for signal. Weak, but present. He dialed the emergency number again. The same voice answered. Status. They hit the cabin early, Marcus said, his voice hoarse. 12 plus hostiles. I escaped through the emergency tunnel. I'm on foot, heading for the northeast cache. We know. We've been tracking your phone. Help is 30 minutes out. Can you hold? I'll try. Marcus, listen carefully. The people who hit that cabin aren't just treasure hunters. We've identified at least 3 active intelligence operatives in the group. This goes higher than we thought. Your uncle wasn't just protecting stolen wealth. He was sitting on leverage against current operations. Marcus's blood ran cold. What kind of operations? The kind that justify killing to protect. You need to understand what you're carrying. That vault isn't just history. It's ammunition. People in very high places want it destroyed or reclaimed. They'll stop at nothing. Then, why did my uncle leave it to me? A pause. Because he believed you'd have the courage to decide what happens next. To either expose it all or protect it like he did. That choice is yours, but make it knowing the stakes. The line went dead. Marcus sat in the cold darkness, processing this new information. His uncle hadn't just hidden evidence of old crimes. He'd maintained leverage against ongoing operations, against people still in power, still making decisions that affected millions. The vault was a loaded gun pointed at the establishment, and Thomas had spent 40 years keeping his finger off the trigger. Now that gun was in Marcus's hands. He thought about the documents he'd seen, the evidence of illegal arms deals, assassinations, coups. He'd assumed they were historical, ancient history that mattered mainly to scholars and investigators. But if active operatives were involved in the retrieval effort, that meant some of those operations were still classified, still sensitive, still dangerous. What had his uncle written in that final letter? The wealth in this vault could change thousands of lives. The documents could expose truths that matter. But exposure meant war. It meant taking on forces with unlimited resources, with the law on their side, with the power to make people disappear. His uncle had chosen protection over exposure, had decided the risk was too great. But he'd also left Marcus the option to make a different choice. Through the storm, Marcus heard engines again. They were still searching, still hunting him. He couldn't stay here. He stood, his muscles protesting, and pushed back into the storm. Copper followed, loyal to the end. They moved through the wilderness like ghosts, following terrain features, staying off ridgelines where they'd be visible. avoiding valleys where they could be trapped. The fire lookout tower appeared through the snow like a monument to isolation. It stood on a rocky outcrop, a wooden structure, maybe 40 feet tall, built in the 1930s and abandoned decades ago. Most people thought it was derelict, but according to his uncle's files, it had been reinforced, weatherproofed, and stocked with supplies. Marcus climbed the steep trail to the base, found the access ladder, and ascended into darkness. The trapdoor at the top was locked, but one of his uncle's keys opened it. He pulled himself inside, dragging his pack and copper after him. The interior was small, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, with windows on all sides, offering panoramic views of the mountains. Equipment lined the walls: a radio, survival gear, weapons, food, fuel, everything someone would need to hide for weeks or months. Marcus lit a small propane heater and collapsed onto a bench. His body was shutting down, demanding rest it couldn't have. But he forced himself to stay alert, to check the perimeter, to ensure he was truly safe. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the mountain. Inside, Marcus finally allowed himself to feel the weight of what had happened. In less than 48 hours, he'd inherited a fortune, discovered his uncle's secret life, been attacked by what amounted to a small army, and become a fugitive in his own mountains. And he still had no idea what he was going to do with any of it. He pulled out the encrypted drive and connected it to a laptop he found in the tower's supplies. The files opened, revealing his uncle's complete archive. Not just inventory lists, but context. Each item in the vault had a story, a history of how it came to be there. The gold bars, for example, weren't just stored wealth. They were payment from a 1987 arms deal that had funded both sides of a Central American conflict. American weapons sold to rebels, American intelligence selling secrets to the government, with gold changing hands in the middle. Thousands had died in that war. Tens of thousands had been displaced. And the gold that had financed it sat in a Montana vault. The bearer bonds were similar, issued by shell companies connected to CIA operations, used to move money without leaving paper trails. Some dated back to Vietnam, others were more recent, connected to operations in the Middle East. And the documents, God, the documents, evidence of crimes that would shock the nation if revealed, proof that the government had assassinated foreign leaders, toppled democracies, funded terrorism, all in the name of national security. Some of it Marcus had suspected existed, much of it he'd never imagined. His uncle had been sitting on the truth about America's shadow war, the one waged in darkness, while citizens slept peacefully, believing their country stood for freedom and justice. What was Marcus supposed to do with that knowledge? Expose it and watch institutions crumble? Protect it and become another guardian of lies? Outside, he heard the distinctive thump of helicopter rotors cutting through the storm. Multiple aircraft approaching from different directions. Through the tower windows, he saw searchlights sweeping the forest below, powerful beams cutting through the snow. They weren't giving up. They were escalating. Marcus grabbed the radio from his pack and switched to the emergency frequency his contact had provided. "This is Reed. They've got helicopters. Multiple aircraft. I'm in the tower, but I'm compromised." The response came immediately. "Confirmed. We see them. Our team is 5 minutes out. Sit tight. And Reed, if they breach the tower, destroy that drive. Don't let them take it intact." Marcus looked at the small device in his hand. This tiny piece of technology that contained enough truth to shatter governments. His uncle had protected it for 40 years. And now, Marcus was being told to destroy it if necessary. He thought about Thomas's letter, about living the life his uncle couldn't, about not letting the cabin become his prison. But freedom had a price, and truth had consequences. Some choices marked you forever, defined who you were, in ways you couldn't escape. The helicopters circled closer, their searchlights probing the darkness. One beam swept across the tower, illuminating the interior for a brief moment, before moving on. They knew he was here. They were just deciding how to extract him. Marcus checked his rifle, made sure it was loaded, and positioned himself where he could cover the trapdoor. Copper pressed against his leg, growling softly. If they came up that ladder, Marcus would have to make a choice. Fight and probably die, or surrender and lose everything. Neither option was good, but life rarely offered good options, only hard choices between bad alternatives. Through the radio, his contact's voice crackled. "Reed, we need you to hold for 3 more minutes. Can you do that?" Marcus looked at the helicopters, at the trapdoor, at the encrypted drive containing secrets worth killing for. 3 minutes, he replied. "I'll give you 3 minutes." He didn't say what he was thinking. That 3 minutes could be a lifetime when men with guns were coming for you. That his uncle had given him an impossible inheritance, an unbearable responsibility. That sometimes the only way to honor someone's sacrifice was to risk everything they died to protect. The searchlights converged on the tower, turning night into day. The helicopter rotors grew deafening, and Marcus Reed, mountain man and inheritor of secrets, prepared to fight for a truth he was only beginning to understand. Below, through the snow and darkness, he saw figures emerging from the tree line. At least 20 men, heavily armed, surrounding the tower. The trapdoor rattled as someone tested it from below. A voice shouted demands he couldn't hear over the helicopters. 2 minutes. Marcus's finger rested on his rifle's trigger. His other hand held the encrypted drive. One contained death. The other contained truth. And in that moment, trapped in a fire tower with an army closing in, Marcus finally understood why his uncle had chosen this life. Because some truths were worth dying for. 1 minute. The trapdoor splintered. Wood cracked. Someone was breaking through. Marcus raised his weapon, prepared to defend himself, prepared to destroy the drive if necessary, prepared to die if that's what it took. 30 seconds. A new sound cut through the chaos. More engines, different pitch. Through the eastern windows, Marcus saw headlights, multiple vehicles, crashing through the forest at high speed. His uncle's network, finally arriving. The helicopters banked away, their pilots, realizing the situation had changed. The men surrounding the tower hesitated, receiving new orders through their communications. 10 seconds. Marcus lowered his rifle slightly, hope flickering in his chest like a candle in the wind. Maybe he'd survive this. Maybe his uncle's planning would save him. Maybe the truth would get its chance to be heard. The trapdoor exploded inward. A figure lunged through the opening, weapon raised. Marcus's finger tightened on the trigger. Time seemed to slow, each microsecond stretching into eternity. And in that frozen moment, Marcus Reed made the choice that would define everything that followed. Not to kill, not to surrender, but to trust the network his uncle had built, to believe that 40 years of preparation would be enough. He lowered his weapon. "Thomas sent me," he said to the figure in the doorway, gambling everything on a password and a promise. The figure froze, then slowly lowered their weapon. "Stand down," they called to others below. "He's one of ours." Marcus let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. The helicopters retreated into the storm. The men surrounding the tower fell back. And through the chaos and darkness, his uncle's network closed around him like a protective wall. 40 years of contingency, planning coming to life in a single moment. He'd survived. Barely. But survival was just the beginning. Now came the harder part. Deciding what to do with $245 million. A vault full of secrets. And the truth about crimes that powerful men would kill to keep hidden. Marcus looked down at the encrypted drive in his hand, and for the first time since this began, he smiled. Not from joy, but from understanding. His uncle hadn't just left him money, he'd left him a weapon. And Marcus was finally beginning to understand how to use it. The figure who'd come through the trapdoor was a woman, mid-50s, with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, and eyes that had seen their share of darkness. She extended a hand to Marcus, her grip firm and sure. "Kate Sullivan," she said. "I worked with your uncle from 1979 to 87. He saved my life twice. I've been waiting 40 years to repay that debt." Marcus shook her hand, still processing the fact that he was alive. Below, he could hear voices organizing, establishing a perimeter, professional and efficient. Through the tower windows, he counted at least 15 vehicles, maybe 20 people, all moving with military precision. "How many?" Marcus asked, gesturing to the activity below. 32, Kate replied. "Former agency, mostly. People Thomas helped over the years, people who owed him. When the emergency protocol activated, we dropped everything and came. Some flew in from across the country. Others were already positioned nearby, waiting. Waiting for what?" Kate's expression hardened. "For this." Thomas knew someday they'd make a move on the vault. He spent decades building a network to counter them. You just activated it. She moved to the windows, scanning the forest. The helicopters pulled back, but they're not gone. Neither are the ground teams. They're regrouping, calling for backup. We've got maybe 2 hours before they come back with overwhelming force. "Who are they?" Marcus asked. The contact on the phone said, "Active intelligence operatives." Kate nodded. "A rogue element within the agency. Not official, nothing you'd find on organizational charts. They're the cleaners, the ones who make problems disappear. When Thomas went dark with the vault in 76, they couldn't touch him because he had leverage, documents that would expose everyone involved. But now he's dead, and they see an opportunity to reclaim everything and eliminate the threat permanently. By eliminating me. Yes. But they didn't count on Thomas's contingency plans, or on you having the courage to activate them." She pulled out a tactical radio and spoke into it. "All units, status report." Voices crackled back, each team confirming their positions. They'd established a defensive perimeter around the tower, set up surveillance equipment, and identified all approach routes. It was military-grade security, assembled in minutes by people who'd done this kind of thing their entire careers. Kate turned back to Marcus. "We can keep you safe for now, but this isn't sustainable. They have more resources, more people, more time. Eventually, they'll overwhelm us. So we need a plan." "What did Thomas leave you besides the vault?" Marcus pulled out the encrypted drive. "Everything. Complete inventory, documentation, context. He also left contact information, financial accounts, instructions." Kate's eyes widened slightly. "May I?" Marcus handed her the drive. She connected it to a ruggedized laptop and began scrolling through the files, her expression growing more serious with each page. "Jesus," she whispered. "I knew the vault was significant, but this. Marcus, do you understand what you're holding? This isn't just evidence of historical crimes. Some of these operations are ongoing. Some of these people are still in power, still making decisions. If this goes public, it would trigger the biggest intelligence scandal in American history. That's what my uncle protected for 40 years. That's what he died protecting." Kate closed the laptop and looked at Marcus with something like respect. "He left it to you because he believed you'd make the right choice. But I have to ask, what choice are you going to make?" Marcus walked to the window, staring out at the storm. The question had been circling in his mind since he'd first opened the vault. What did right even mean in this situation? "Tell me about my uncle," he said. "Really, tell me. Not the legend, not the mystery. Who was Thomas Reed?" Kate was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of old grief. "He was the most principled man I ever met. And the loneliest. When I first worked with him, I thought he was cold, detached. But I came to understand that he felt everything too deeply. He saw the world clearly, saw all the corruption and compromise, and it broke his heart. So he made a choice. Be part of the machine or stand apart from it. He chose isolation. He chose integrity, Kate corrected. The agency wanted him to bury the evidence, to make the vault disappear into some black site where it would never be found. They offered him money, protection, a comfortable retirement. But Thomas said no. He said someone needed to remember the truth, even if that someone could never tell it. She moved closer to the window, her reflection ghostly in the glass. For 40 years, he lived in that cabin, guarding secrets that ate at him every single day. I visited him once, back in '83. I asked him why he didn't just expose everything, blow the whistle, let the chips fall where they may. You know what he said? Marcus shook his head. He said, "Because I'm not sure the country would survive the truth." He believed in America, despite everything he'd seen, despite knowing how corrupt parts of it had become. He thought maybe someday, when the time was right, when the country was stronger, the truth could come out. But not yet. Not on his watch. So he sacrificed his life to protect a country that used him and threw him away. He sacrificed his life to protect an ideal, Kate said firmly. The difference matters. Outside, one of Kate's people signaled from below. She spoke into her radio, listened, then turned to Marcus with a grim expression. They're mobilizing. Federal agents, legitimately this time, with warrants. Someone high up made calls. In 90 minutes, this tower will be surrounded by FBI, ATF, maybe even military. They're going to claim this is a national security matter, that you're in possession of stolen government property. Are they wrong? Marcus asked. Legally? No. That vault contains assets obtained through classified operations. By the letter of the law, it belongs to the government. But morally, Kate's jaw tightened. That gold was paid in blood. Those documents expose crimes. The government's claim is legally sound but ethically bankrupt. Marcus felt the walls closing in again. So my options are surrender the vault or spend the rest of my life as a fugitive. Those are 2 options, Kate said. But there's a third. It's risky, probably won't work, and could get you killed. But it's what your uncle would have done. Tell me. Kate pulled up a file on the laptop, a list of names and contact information. These are journalists, honest ones, people who've exposed corruption before and survived. These are senators and representatives, the few who actually give a damn about oversight. These are lawyers who specialize in whistleblower cases. And these, she opened another file, are historians and archivists, people who understand the value of truth. Marcus saw where this was going. You want me to go public. I want you to go strategic, Kate corrected. You can't just dump $245 million worth of evidence on the internet and hope for the best. This needs to be coordinated, protected, legitimized. You release the information through proper channels, with legal protection, with media coverage that makes you too visible to disappear. You make yourself the story, so they can't make you a casualty. And the vault gets turned over to an independent foundation. Not the government, but a civilian oversight organization with the authority to investigate and preserve historical evidence. The gold gets liquidated and used to compensate victims of the operations it funded. The documents get authenticated and released in stages, with proper context. The whole thing becomes an official reckoning, not a cover-up or a scandal. It was ambitious, maybe impossible, but Marcus could see the logic. His uncle had spent 40 years protecting the truth. Maybe it was time to set it free, but carefully, strategically, in a way that honored Thomas's sacrifice while achieving what he'd never dared attempt. How long would I have? Marcus asked. If we move fast, the foundation could be established in 72 hours. The key journalists contacted in 24. Legal protections filed immediately. But you'd have to commit now, and you'd have to be willing to become the face of this. No more hiding in the mountains. No more isolation. You'd be thrust into the spotlight, And you'd stay there for years while this plays out. Marcus thought about his 17 years of solitude, his deliberate withdrawal from the world. He'd chosen the mountains because they were simple, honest, uncompromising. People complicated things. Society corrupted things. But his uncle had learned a harder truth. Hiding from the world didn't change it. Sometimes you had to step into the chaos to make a difference. There's something else, Kate said quietly. If you do this, if you go public, your family will find out. They'll learn about Thomas, about what he did, about why he disappeared. They'll learn about you, too, about your role in this. You can't control how they react. Marcus hadn't thought about his family in years, had assumed that bridge was burned beyond repair. But Kate was right. This would drag them all back into his life, whether he wanted it or not. His satellite phone rang. He answered it, and his father's voice, older than he remembered, but still sharp with judgment, came through. Marcus, I heard you inherited your uncle's place. I'm calling to tell you to walk away from whatever crazy scheme you're contemplating. Thomas was a fool who wasted his life on paranoid delusions. Don't make the same mistake. Marcus felt old anger rising but pushed it down. How did you get this number? I called in favors. I still have connections. And those connections are telling me you're in over your head, that you're involved in something that could destroy what's left of this family's reputation. So I'm telling you, as your father, walk away. You haven't been my father for 17 years, Marcus said quietly. You lost that right when you told me I'd never amount to anything. I said that because I didn't want you ending up like Thomas, living alone in the wilderness, cut off from reality, chasing phantoms. He wasn't chasing phantoms, Marcus said, his voice steel. He was protecting the truth. And I'm going to finish what he started. He ended the call. Kate raised an eyebrow. That sounded cathartic. It was necessary. Marcus looked at the encrypted drive, at the laptop displaying names and contacts, at the storm still raging outside. I'm doing it. Going public. Establishing the foundation. All of it. You're sure? No. But I'm doing it anyway. Kate smiled. The first genuine smile Marcus had seen from her. Thomas chose well. Okay. Let's move. We've got work to do, and very little time. The next 72 hours were the most intense of Marcus's life. Kate's network moved with stunning efficiency, executing a plan they'd clearly rehearsed countless times. Lawyers filed paperwork establishing the Reed Foundation for Historical Preservation, naming Marcus as founder and trustee. Journalists were contacted with encrypted previews of what the vault contained. Academic historians were brought in to begin authentication. And Marcus, thrust into the center of it all, gave interview after interview, telling his uncle's story and his own. The government moved to stop them, of course. Federal agents raided the cabin, only to find the vault already emptied, its contents transferred to secure locations across 3 states. Warrants were issued for Marcus's arrest, then mysteriously withdrawn when major newspapers ran front-page stories about the whistleblower who'd inherited $245 million in evidence of government crimes. Marcus became famous overnight, his face on every news channel, his story told and retold. The mountain man who'd inherited secrets, the nephew honoring his uncle's sacrifice, the whistleblower who wouldn't back down. It was overwhelming and exhausting, and nothing like the life he'd chosen. But it was also purposeful in ways Marcus had never experienced. He wasn't just fixing engines or guiding hunters anymore. He was fighting for something that mattered, for truth and accountability, and his uncle's legacy. 6 months after opening the vault, Marcus stood in a federal courthouse in Washington, testifying before a congressional committee about what he'd found. The gold had been liquidated, generating $212 million that was being distributed to documented victims of the operations it had funded. The documents were being released in coordinated stages, each revelation triggering investigations and reforms. And the cabin, Thomas's lonely fortress had been preserved as a historical site, a monument to one man's 40-year stand against corruption. But it was what happened after the testimony that changed everything. Marcus stepped out of the courthouse into bright summer sunshine and found his sister waiting on the steps. Jennifer, younger by 3 years, whom he hadn't seen since she was 21. She'd aged well, carried herself with confidence, but her eyes held the same uncertainty Marcus felt. "Hi," she said simply. "Hi," he replied. They stood in awkward silence for a moment. Then Jennifer spoke, her voice tight with emotion. "I read Uncle Thomas's journals, the ones you released to the press. I had no idea what he went through, what he sacrificed. None of us did. And I had no idea what Dad said to you, why you left." She stepped closer, tears forming. "I'm so sorry, Marcus. Sorry I didn't defend you. Sorry I let you go. Sorry I believed their version. Instead of finding out the truth." Marcus felt something crack in his chest. Some wall he'd built 17 years ago finally crumbling. "I'm sorry, too. Sorry. I ran, instead of fighting. Sorry I disappeared." Jennifer hugged him then, fierce and sudden, and Marcus hugged her back, both of them crying on the courthouse steps while cameras flashed and strangers watched. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. That evening, Marcus met with Kate and the Foundation's board at a hotel in Arlington. They reviewed the progress. 12 major investigations launched, 4 criminal referrals made, countless reforms proposed. The vault's contents had triggered the reckoning Thomas had hoped for, shaking institutions and exposing truths that had been buried for decades. "You did it," Kate said, raising her glass. "You honored Thomas's memory and changed history. Not bad for a mountain man." Marcus smiled, but felt the weight of what remained. The work's not done. Some of those documents are still classified. Some of the people involved are still in power. This fight will take years. "Then we fight for years," Kate replied. "That's what Thomas did. That's what we'll do." Marcus looked around the table at the faces of his uncle's network, people who'd given up comfortable retirements to support a stranger's crusade for truth. They were old, scarred, tired, but they were also unbowed, uncompromising, still fighting. "Why?" Marcus asked. "Why does this matter so much to all of you?" An older man across the table, a former operative named Chen, spoke up. "Because someone needs to remember. Someone needs to stand witness to what was done in our names. Your uncle understood that. He carried that burden alone for 40 years. Now, you're carrying it, and we're helping you carry it. That's how this works. That's how truth survives." Marcus nodded, understanding flooding through him. This was why Thomas had chosen isolation, why he'd sacrificed everything. Not because he was broken or paranoid or damaged, but because he understood something fundamental. That truth without guardians dies. That someone has to stand in the darkness and say, "This happened. This mattered. We will not forget." 3 years after opening the vault, Marcus stood on the porch of his uncle's cabin. It looked different now, restored and maintained, with a small visitors' center nearby, where tourists could learn about Thomas Reed's life and legacy. The surrounding land had been protected as a wilderness preserve, the vault sealed but documented, a testament to one man's extraordinary commitment. Marcus had changed too. His beard was trimmed now, his clothes cleaner, his posture more relaxed. He split his time between the Foundation's offices in Seattle and the cabin, needing both the engagement and the solitude. He'd learned, finally, that isolation and connection weren't opposites. They were partners, each one essential in its own way. Jennifer visited often, bringing her children to see the mountains their great-uncle had loved. His father had reached out once, a stiff letter acknowledging he'd been wrong about Thomas and, by extension, about Marcus. It wasn't much, but it was something. Some relationships could be repaired, Others just needed to be released. The foundation had grown beyond anything Marcus had imagined. They'd taken on other cases, other whistleblowers, other hidden truths. The Reed Foundation had become synonymous with accountability and historical preservation, a place where truth could be protected and eventually revealed. But it was the small town of Whitefish that showed Marcus the real impact of his uncle's legacy. The liquidated gold had funded a community center, scholarships for local kids, programs for veterans. The publicity had brought tourists, which brought jobs, which brought hope to a region that had been dying slowly for decades. Marcus walked through town one afternoon and saw his uncle's name on a memorial plaque. Thomas Reed, Guardian of Truth, 1951 to 2024. He lived alone, but never for himself. An older woman approached. Someone Marcus vaguely recognized from his childhood. "You're Thomas's nephew," she said, "the one who told his story." "Yes, ma'am. I wanted to thank you. My grandson got a scholarship from your foundation. He's studying history now, wants to be a teacher, says he wants to help people understand the truth about their country, the good and the bad. Says your uncle inspired him." Marcus felt his throat tighten. "Your uncle would be proud," the woman continued. "He may have lived alone, but his life touched so many people, especially through you." After she left, Marcus sat on a bench in the town square, watching people go about their lives. Kids playing, couples walking, old men arguing about politics. Ordinary life, made possible by extraordinary sacrifice. His uncle had given up everything so that truth could survive, and now that truth was changing lives, opening eyes, creating ripples that would continue long after everyone involved was gone. That night, Marcus returned to the cabin one last time before heading back to Seattle. He stood in the main room, remembering how it had looked that first day, dark and mysterious and full of secrets. Now it was just a room, restored and preserved, a piece of history that would outlive them all. He descended into the vault, now empty except for display cases, holding photographs and documents, explaining what had been found and where it had gone. At the center stood a bronze statue of his uncle, commissioned by the foundation, showing Thomas as he must have looked at 50, strong and determined and utterly alone. Marcus placed his hand on the statue's shoulder. "You were right," he said quietly. "About me, about the choice, about everything. I understand now why you lived the way you did. And I promise, I'll make sure people keep understanding. Your story won't be forgotten, not as long as I'm alive." He climbed back up to the main cabin, locked the door, and walked out into the Montana night. The stars overhead were brilliant, the same stars his uncle had watched for 40 years. The mountain stood eternal, indifferent to human drama, but somehow bearing witness to it anyway. Marcus had come to these mountains 17 years ago to escape. He'd inherited this cabin 3 years ago, expecting nothing but complications. But what he'd found was purpose, connection, and a legacy worth defending. He wasn't the isolated loner anymore, hiding from the world. He was Thomas Reed's nephew, guardian of truth, carrying forward a mission that would define the rest of his life. And somewhere, in whatever came after death, Marcus hoped his uncle was proud. 6 months later, the Reed Foundation announced its largest initiative yet, the Truth and Reconciliation Archive, a permanent repository for whistleblower evidence and historical documents that powerful institutions wanted buried. It would be housed in a new building, constructed near the original cabin, designed to preserve truth for future generations. At the groundbreaking ceremony, Marcus gave a speech to a crowd of hundreds, his voice carrying across the mountain clearing. "My uncle spent 40 years protecting secrets in isolation. But isolation wasn't the goal. Truth was. And truth only matters if it's shared, if it changes things, if it helps people understand their history so they can build a better future." This archive isn't about the past. It's about making sure we learn from it. The crowd applauded, but Marcus wasn't finished. We're also announcing the Thomas Reed Scholarship Program, fully funded in perpetuity, providing education to young people who want to pursue truth, accountability, and justice. Because my uncle believed that ordinary people, people without power or connections, could still make a difference. He proved it. And now we're going to help others prove it too. Jennifer stood in the front row, tears streaming down her face, proud of her brother in ways she'd never imagined possible. Beside her stood Kate Sullivan and the other members of Thomas's network, old warriors, finally seeing their friend's sacrifice honored properly. As the ceremony concluded and people mingled, Marcus found himself standing alone for a moment, looking up at the cabin where it all began. He thought about the scared, isolated man he'd been, running from family and expectations. He thought about his uncle, dying alone, but not forgotten, sacrificing everything for a principle most people didn't even know existed. And he thought about the encrypted drive in his pocket, the one containing the last secrets from the vault, documents so sensitive they couldn't be released yet. Maybe not for 10 years, maybe 20. But someday, when the time was right, when the country was ready, the final truths would emerge, because that was the commitment Marcus had made, not just to his uncle, but to every person who'd ever been silenced, every truth that had ever been buried, every sacrifice made in the name of something larger than self. Copper, now gray-muzzled and slower, pressed against Marcus's leg. The dog had been with him through it all, from that first terrifying night in the storm, to the congressional testimony, to this moment of triumph and memory. Marcus scratched behind his ears, grateful for the simple loyalty of an animal who asked nothing but gave everything. "We did good, boy," Marcus whispered. "Uncle Thomas would be proud." The sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. In the growing darkness, the cabin's lights glowed warm and welcoming. No longer a fortress or a prison, but a beacon. People were already planning visits, researchers wanting to study the archive, students hoping to learn, journalists seeking inspiration. The isolation was over. The hiding was done. Marcus Reed, once a man running from himself, had become a man others ran toward when they needed truth, protected, and justice served. And in that transformation, in that journey from isolation to purpose, he'd discovered something his uncle had known all along, that the hardest choices create the most meaningful lives. That standing alone for truth matters more than standing with crowds for comfort. That legacy isn't what you leave behind, but what you inspire others to carry forward. Anyone can inherit wealth, but it takes courage to inherit responsibility. It takes strength to transform a frozen log cabin and hidden fortune into a foundation for truth. And it takes wisdom to understand that some gifts come with burdens that define us, change us, and ultimately reveal who we were meant to be all along. As the stars emerged one by one over the Montana wilderness, Marcus Reed, guardian of his uncle's legacy and protector of truth, walked back toward the lights and the people and the work that would fill his days. Behind him, the cabin stood silent and proud, no longer hiding secrets but celebrating them, no longer isolated but connected to something far larger than itself. Because sometimes the greatest treasures aren't the ones we find buried in vaults. They're the ones we discover within ourselves when we're brave enough to accept an impossible inheritance and wise enough to use it for something that matters. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories of courage, legacy, and lives transformed by impossible choices. Click to continue the journey with us. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe that truth matters, that sacrifice deserves honor, and that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they find the courage to stand for something bigger than themselves.